Welcome to the channel Medieval Chronicles, and thank you for joining us for a journey into one of the most pivotal and dramatic moments in English history, the Battle of Bosworth Field. In today's video, we'll be reading a gripping contemporary account of this fateful battle as recorded in the continuation of John Harding's chronicle by Richard Grafton, a prominent Tudor-era historian and printer. The Battle of Bosworth, fought on the 22nd of August 1485, brought a decisive end to the dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York that had raged across England for decades. It marked the fall of the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, and the rise of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII. The significance of this battle cannot be overstated. It was not only the end of a king, but the close of a medieval epoch, making way for the dawn of the early modern period in English history. Richard Grafton's continuation of John Harding's chronicle is a fascinating source. Harding, a loyal Lancastrian in his earlier years, wrote a historical chronicle that was intended to justify the Lancastrian claim to the throne. Grafton, writing during the reign of the Tudors, picks up where Harding left off, continuing the story through the lens of Tudor legitimacy. As such, his account of the battle is both vivid and politically charged, full of action, treachery, shifting loyalties, and the fall of a controversial monarch. In this reading, you'll hear Grafton describing the chaos of the battlefield, the defection of key nobles, and the final moments of Richard III, who, according to legend and Grafton's pen, fought bravely to the end, before being slain in the carnage. Whether you're a student of history, a lover of historical drama, or simply curious about the real-life Game of Thrones that was the War of the Roses, this reading offers a rare chance to hear the events of Bosworth as told by a voice from the 16th century. So, sit back and let the echoes of history speak through the words of Richard Grafton. This is the Battle of Bosworth, as chronicled in the continuation of John Hardyng. At that time, it was reported that Henry had arrived in Shrewsbury without any harm. Upon hearing this news, King Richard flew into a rage and furiously accused those around him of betraying him and breaking their oaths. He became suspicious of everyone, unsure of whom he could trust, and so decided it was best to take matters into his own hands and go out personally to confront his enemies. He immediately sent out scouts to find out which route Henry was taking. After doing their job, they returned and reported that Henry was at Lichfield. Upon learning this, and with a large number of soldiers having gathered, Richard ordered his men into formation. He instructed them to march in columns of 4 and follow the route where they had heard the enemy was coming. Suspect individuals were placed in the middle of the column, while Richard himself, with the troops he trusted most, followed behind, flanked by wings of cavalry. In this order, around sunset, they arrived at Leicester. Meanwhile, Henry had moved from Lichfield to the nearby village of Tamworth. On the way, he met with Walter Hungerford, Thomas Bouchier, and many others who had promised their support. Knowing they were suspected by Richard, and fearing they might be forcibly taken to him, their enemy, they abandoned their commander, Robert Brackenbury, and secretly left in the night to join Henry. Along the way, Henry experienced something noteworthy. Despite his noble courage and growing army, he was deeply afraid, uncertain about the loyalty of Thomas Stanley, who, as mentioned earlier, had not yet chosen a side out of fear for his son's life. Because of this, Henry, though nearly in despair, travelled with just 20 men, worrying constantly about what to do. To make matters worse, he received news that Richard was rapidly approaching with a huge army. Lingering behind out of fear, Henry became separated from his main force, who reached Tamworth ahead of him. It being dark, he lost both his way and his companions. Wandering anxiously, he eventually arrived at a small village about 3 miles from his army, gripped by fear. Too afraid to speak to anyone, he stayed there overnight, taking the night's confusion as a bad omen. Meanwhile, his army, seeing he was missing, was equally dismayed. In the morning, Henry returned and explained that he had not been lost, but had deliberately to meet privately with certain friends who could not be seen with him during the day. He then travelled to Atherstone, where Thomas Stanley and his brother William lived. There, Henry met with the Stanleys, greeting them warmly and happily. They discussed their strategy for confronting King Richard, whom they now knew was not far away. That evening, John Savage, Sir Brian Sandford, Simon Digby, and many others defected from Richard's army and joined Henry with a large number of men. This significantly strengthened Henry's position. Meanwhile, King Richard, determined to see the matter through, arrived at Bosworth, just beyond Leicester. It seemed as though the hand of divine justice had brought him to that place to face punishment for his crimes. He set up camp there for the night. Before sleeping, Richard gave a passionate speech to his troops, urging them to fight bravely. However, he reportedly had a terrible dream that night. He saw demons dragging and tormenting him, leaving him sleepless and full of dread. When he awoke, overwhelmed by fear and guilt, he took it as a sign of his impending downfall. Though he tried to hide his distress, his demeanour was far less confident than usual. To dispel rumours that he was afraid, he told his men about the dream. But it was likely not a dream at all, rather his guilty conscience finally tormenting him. In the morning, Richard prepared his army for battle. First came a massive vanguard of horsemen and foot soldiers, terrifying to behold. Archers were placed at the front as a strong defence. John, Duke of Norfolk, led this group. Richard followed with a large force. Henry, having also made his arrangements, pitched his camp near his enemies. He ordered his men to be ready at dawn and sent word to Thomas Stanley, who was camped between the two armies, asking him to join. Stanley replied that he would position his troops in order and then join, an answer that confused and unsettled Henry. Still, he didn't delay and placed his men into formation. Henry's forward line was small and lightly equipped. Archers were placed in front, led by John, Earl of Oxford. On the right flank stood Gilbert Talbot, on the left John Savage. Henry himself, with help from Thomas Stanley, followed with a small group of cavalry and a handful of foot soldiers. His entire force, numbering about 5,000, excluding the Stanley forces, of which William Stanley had 3,000. Richard's army was twice that size. As the two armies came into sight of each other, both sides made a show of strength, waiting for the signal to engage. Between them lay a marsh, which Henry deliberately kept on his right to protect his men. He also ensured the bright sun was at his back, so it would shine into the eyes of his enemies. When Richard saw Henry crossing the marsh, he ordered his men to attack. Arrows flew from both sides, followed by fierce sword fighting. Earl Oxford, fearing that Richard's larger army might surround his smaller force, ordered his men to advance only in tightly packed groups of 5, moving no more than 10 feet forward. Richard's soldiers, confused and suspicious of a trap, began to break ranks, many of whom had no desire for Richard to win, and so fought without heart. Oxford's men then pressed forward more forcefully, and others followed suit. In the middle of the battle, Richard spotted Henry at a distance, surrounded by only a few men. Furious, Richard spurred his horse and charged like a lion through the fray. Henry, seeing him approach, was eager to meet him in combat. Richard killed several of Henry's men, struck down his standard bearer, William Brandon, and even overpowered Sir John Cheney, a man of great strength. He carved a path through the ranks, aiming to reach Henry himself, but Henry held his ground better than expected, despite being nearly in despair. Just then, William Stanley arrived with 4,000 men, turning the tide. At the time, Richard's remaining forces began to flee. Richard, fighting alone in the midst of his enemies, was surrounded and killed. Meanwhile, Oxford led a successful charge and routed the rest of Richard's army, killing many. Still more fled without fighting, as they had little loyalty to Richard and hoped for his downfall. Only about 1,000 died in total. Among the fallen nobles were John, Duke of Norfolk, Walter Ferrers, Robert Brackenbury, Richard Ratcliffe, and others. 2 days later, William Catesby and other followers of Richard were executed in Leicester. Those who escaped included Francis Lovell, Humphrey Stafford, and his brother Thomas, who fled to sanctuary in Colchester, Essex. Many surrendered after Richard's death, throwing down their weapons, most of whom would have done so sooner, if not for fear of Richard's spies. Among the captured were the Earls of Northumberland and Surrey. Surrey was imprisoned. Northumberland, who had stayed neutral, was taken back into favour. Henry lost fewer than 100 men, the most notable being William Brandon, his standard bearer. The battle took place on the 22nd of August 1485, lasted over 2 hours and was fiercely contested. Richard could have escaped but refused to flee. His companions had urged him to ride away when it became clear that the battle was lost, even providing him with a swift horse. But Richard, scorning the idea, reportedly said, "This day I will end the battle or my life." This speaks to his bravery, or perhaps his desperation, since he saw this day as the moment he would either win the crown or lose everything. In the end, he died as many do who follow only ambition and wickedness instead of law and virtue. Henry, having won, knelt and offered heartfelt thanks to God. Filled with joy, he climbed a nearby hill and praised his soldiers, ordering the wounded to be treated and the dead to be buried. He thanked his captains, promising never to forget their loyalty. The crowd, united in joy, proclaimed him king. Thomas Stanley, seeing the moment, took Richard's crown, found among the spoils, and placed it on Henry's head, as if the people had elected him king, as in ancient times. This was the first sign of his good fortune. Henry then travelled to Leicester, where, after 2 days of rest, he and his men prepared to march to London. Richard's naked body was slung over a horse, with head and limbs hanging on either side, a pitiful sight, but fitting given his deeds. He was buried without ceremony at the Greyfriars in Leicester. Richard had reigned for just 2 years, 2 months and 1 day. He was small, with a twisted body, one shoulder higher than the other, a short face and a cruel expression that reflected his cunning and malicious nature. He constantly bit his lower lip in thought, revealing his harsh temper, and fiddled endlessly with his dagger. Though he had a sharp, clever mind, and he was skilled at deception, his pride and cruelty never left him, even to his final breath, where he chose death by the sword rather than escape in shame. So in conclusion, the Battle of Bosworth was far more than just a military clash. It was the turning point that reshaped the destiny of England. Richard III's dramatic fall and Henry Tudor's unlikely rise marked not only the end of the Wars of the Roses, but also the beginning of a new era. As Grafton's account makes clear, the battle was as much about loyalty, betrayal and shifting allegiances as it was about swords and shields. The choices of men like the Stanleys determined the fate of kings, showing how fragile power could be in this turbulent age. Richard's last stand has echoed through the centuries, remembered both for its defiance and its futility. Grafton portrays him as a man haunted by guilt and desperation, yet unyielding in his resolve to fight to the death rather than flee. Whether we see this as bravery or arrogance, his fall symbolised the passing of the medieval world. By contrast, Henry's triumph, crowned on the battlefield itself, signalled the dawn of Tudor stability, a dynasty that would dominate England for over a century and leave an indelible mark on its culture and politics. In the end, Bosworth Field remains one of the most dramatic stages in English history, a moment where fate, ambition and chance collided. Through Richard Grafton's words, we glimpse both the chaos of the fight and the profound consequences that followed. From the ashes of defeat and the spoils of victory emerged a new chapter in the nation's story, proving that even in the bloodiest of battles, history is shaped not only by swords, but by the shifting tides of loyalty and the hand of fortune. Thank you for watching Medieval Chronicles YouTube channel.